I learned to measure time by the color of the sky, when it turns that copper orange like a penny, warmed in a child's palm, that when the truth likes to come walking up our street. Night, I'm thinking of, I was standing at this very window with one hand on the sill, and the other around a mug that had long since gone cold. I wasn't expecting anyone, I wasn't expecting anything. It had been years since I asked the evening for favors. Then, I saw him, a figure on the sidewalk, not rushing, not lagging, moving like a person who knows he can change a life by taking one more step. In his hand, a thick, off-white envelope, the kind that makes a sound when you set it down, the kind that weighs more than paper. He stopped beneath my porch light and raised his eyes to the glass. I don't know why I opened the door. Maybe because I had promised once to be here at dusk. Maybe because the sky, oh, that sky was the same copper it was the last time my world turned over. "Ma'am," he said, holding out the envelope, "this belongs to you." I didn't know if opening it would save us, or break us for good. "Sweetheart, if you're listening, you there by the end of the couch with the blanket over your knees today, we're going to talk about what I kept by this window. We're going to talk about why I still stand here every evening and what the dusk once meant in this house. If stories like this give you courage, if they remind you of who raised you and what you can stand for, then tap that little button and stay with me. I don't need applause. I need company. And if what I say helps you sleep a little easier tonight, share it with someone who could use a warm voice. Before you judge me, before you wonder why I didn't tell the whole town the whole truth, you should know what this house looked like when the days were longer and I had two good knees under me and a promise to keep. You see that smudge on the glass? I leave it there on purpose. It's the print of my thumb from a night I never want to forget. The sill here is nicked where your grandfather set a radio during the World Series. Lord, he thought that old team was going to take us someplace grand if he just leaned in closer to the announcer. Over there, the lamp, we keep the shade tilted so the light is warm but not too bright. Dusk likes a soft room. Thought the kettle will hum when it gets to singing, and the fridge rattles like it's arguing with its own motor. That hum keeps me company. If you listen close, you'll catch the screen door complaining on its hinges, and the neighbor's dog asking the night to explain itself. It's ordinary music, the kind you miss only when it goes quiet. I stand here most evenings, not because I expect miracles, and not because I'm afraid to sit. I stand because once upon a time I told the man I loved that I'd be here when the day was done, no matter how it had treated us. I said, at dusk, come home. If you're late, I'll wait by the window. If you're early, I'll put the kettle on. Either way, I'll be here. The first year we were married, we had a table that wobbled, a couch that shed its stuffing like dandelion seeds, and a car that insisted on choosing its own mornings. We had more months than money, and we learned a simple trick: fold the grocery receipt in half and breathe, because the numbers look kinder that way. Still, we had a pride about us, not the kind that needs attention, the kind that tucks a shirt in and shows up 5 minutes early even when nobody's watching. You ask me why the window and not the door. Doors are for visitors. Windows are for promises. A door says, come in. A window says, I'm still here. Once, when you were little, and the fever had you pink as a peony, I stood right here and counted the seconds between your breaths, because your mother needed to sleep and I had learned how to wait without making a fuss. That's a talent, darling. Don't ever let anyone tell you stillness is nothing. Stillness is a choice. There is a bread tin on the sill, see it? Dented lid, blue paint fading along the edges, a picture of a wheat field before harvest. Your grandfather said it was too pretty to toss but too banged up for the pantry. We kept notes in it, grocery lists, phone numbers from the church prayer chain, a postcard once from a cousin who wrote more like a poet than a farmer. Over time, it became a little treasury of what didn't fit anywhere else. Or maybe it just got good at holding secrets. You want to know what it held for me? On a certain night, it held a feeling I could only describe as not yet. Not yet the truth, not yet the collapse, not yet the comfort. Dusk is full of not yets. That's why it makes my heart feel like a porch light. And that window, this window, once showed me something I still can't explain. I'll tell you, but first, I want you to know how we got here. How a girl becomes a wife, and a wife becomes a woman who can stand in a room by herself and say, I will be kind, and I will not be moved. I grew up in a town where the hardware store smelled like sawdust and oil, where you could find 3 kinds of nails in 3 kinds of jars, and a man who'd teach you the difference if you asked respectfully. Saturdays, we walked to the diner that had a jukebox with a stubborn D7 button. You had to press it and then nudge it with your knuckle to get Patsy Cline to sing. The owner pretended not to notice our trick because he was a tender-hearted man who liked to see 2 girls laugh with their eyes closed. We worked young, stocking shelves, sweeping aisles, counting change like it mattered because it did. I learned the names of tools I would never lift and the price of milk in every season. I learned that how you say good morning tells the truth about what you did with your night. He was not the loudest boy in the room, thank God. He was a steady one, the kind who showed up with a car that coughed but always started, and manners that would make a teacher nod. He had hands that looked like they'd already shaken too many hard days, and a smile he didn't hand out freely. When he did, you felt included in a secret the world was trying to keep from decent people. We split a milkshake once, vanilla, which he said was honest because it didn't have to shout. He drove with one hand on the wheel and one on the idea of a future. He told me he respected silence. That's how I knew. There are boys who need noise to prove they're men, and there are men who understand that kindness makes its own sound. I married the second kind. We had a rule in my family: no letters opened after sunset. Not a superstition, more of a practice. Daylight for decisions, night for rest. My mother would set the mail aside, pat it like a sleeping cat, and say, "Tomorrow can carry its own weight." I kept that rule out of habit, not fear. Some habits become the kind of fence you're grateful to have when the wind rises. When he asked me to marry him, he didn't get down on one knee. He took my hands across the diner table and said, "I can't promise you easy, but I can promise you honest." I told him, "I don't need driftwood, I need a dock." We laughed because we were trying to be poetic and ending up true instead. Love gave me courage. It also gave me a secret to keep, the soft kind that isn't hiding so much as protecting. He had a name he didn't explain, a place he went some evenings, a way of folding a paper that said he'd been taught to make words behave. I didn't pry, not because I was scared, but because dignity lets a man speak in his own time, and because I believed in the promise we made. At dusk, "Come home. If you're late, I'll wait." We started in a second-floor walk-up that creaked like it liked us. The carpet was a little tired, the paint was a little optimistic, and the landlord was a widower who pretended he was busy when he was really lonely. We thanked God for everything: a stove that obeyed, a bed that didn't wobble on Tuesdays, the smell of a neighbor's laundry when it drifted beneath our door and told us someone nearby had found order in a day. Our first Christmas, we split a ham and a smile, and a bill we met in the middle. Our first baby slept like a politician, noisy when watched, quiet when ignored. We survived on coupons and casseroles and hope. We kept our promise. At dusk, I'd be at the window. If he was late, I would count to 3 and then start again. Some nights he'd come in with sawdust in his hair and a story about a man who bought the wrong size screws and the patience it took to make that right. Other nights he'd come in with no story at all, just the kind of silence that needs a hand on the shoulder, not a question mark. I noticed the quiet fault line, the way you notice a hairline crack in a favorite mug. You drink from the other side and pretend it's fine. It was a name he wouldn't say, a lunchtime he never scheduled, a street he avoided. I told myself, perhaps correctly, that everyone deserves a few private inches of their own life. I told myself, perhaps incorrectly, that I didn't need to know everything to keep a promise. Then came the night the phone rang while the sky turned orange, and I broke the rule I was raised on. I remember the ring, not the old bell-shaped clatter, but a modern tone, thin and too polite for the message it carried. I glanced at the window, first Habiton, then at the phone, as if I could read the number by its manners. "Is this Mrs.?" The voice had city starch in it. "Yes, sir." A pause, a paper shuffle, a cough that wanted to sound official. "We have certified correspondence that must be delivered today. Are you able to sign at your residence before 8 p.m.? 8 p.m. The rule echoed in my bones. No letters after sunset. But the sky was already lacquered in that copper light, and my good sense got edged out by something I can only call dread mixed with duty. "I'll be here," I said. I boiled water just to have an excuse to keep busy. I set 2 cups out, habitant, put the bread tin on the sill because sometimes, You need the old things near you when the new things arrive. At 7:46, a car door closed with a soft certainty. The man on the porch was younger than his suit and older than his eyes. He held out the envelope like a priest offers a blessing or a warning. Sign here, ma'am. My pen felt heavier than mine. I wrote my name as if it were a test, and he handed me the past, sealed and stamped. Inside, my husband's name in a handwriting I recognized from a life I had not been invited to. Figures that would make a banker whistle, a phrase, deferred disbursement, that wore a tie and hid a story, and a date circled in red. If I signed, I risked betraying a promise he'd kept by not telling me the whole of it. If I refused, I risked losing what he'd bled days to build. I told no one, not even the man I loved. Bills reproduce like rabbits when they believe you aren't looking. The electric came early, the gas came rude. The doctor's office sent a reminder disguised as kindness. I walked to the bank with my best purse and my most patient smile, and asked to speak to the manager because sometimes you aim straight at the person whose name is on the door. He was younger than the title on his desk. His hair was the kind that obeys gel and ambition. He called me ma'am so many times I began to worry I'd aged 10 years on the walkover. I'm trying to understand a document, I said, laying it out like a map I wasn't sure I could read. It has my husband's name. He put on his glasses, like a man about to see a spectacle. He scanned, he pursed, he hummed a small tune of confusion. This is unusual, he said, as if that could be news to me. In what way? In the way that suggests a private arrangement, compensation, possibly a structured settlement, but the originating entity, well, he tapped a line that led me to a P.O. box, and a name that sounded less like a person than a disguise. Do I have what I need to claim it? I asked. He smiled like a substitute teacher. Do you have proof? Additional documentation? We'd need something verifiable. Proof. The town loved that word when it wasn't on their own doorstep. Proof that the boy said that. Proof that the company did this. Proof that God listened to the prayers of a woman who didn't know how to stop asking. I left with less than I came for. In the grocery, a clerk I'd watched grow up to a decent kindness looked at my cart as if it could tell him whether I was rich or poor today. At the diner, someone held a menu too high to hide their listening. I tucked the letter tighter into my purse. It felt hot, like a fresh pie you can't put down because where would you put it that's worthy? Then the bank called in the evening again asking for documents I didn't have, words I couldn't supply. The manager said, "You understand our position." "I understand your posture," I said, and surprised us both. My best friend, well, that's a phrase that changes by decade, used to bring me lilacs in a jar and jokes told badly, which are the best kind. We'd swap recipes and stories and pieces of ourselves we didn't know where else to set. She had a laugh that liked to put its feet on the furniture. When the whispers began, her visits got shorter. Her eyes learned to track the corners of my house, as if the walls could confess. One afternoon she stood in my kitchen with empty hands and polite shoulders. "I heard you had a windfall," she said, as if windfall were a word you could say without it blowing your hair back. "I have a letter," I answered, "and a headache." She smiled like church. "Must be nice." "Nice is a clean sink and no calls after 10, I said, refusing the bait. That night, a dish appeared on my porch casserole, still warm, with a note that said, "Thinking of you." The next morning the casserole dish came back to me washed spotless, as if it had been trying to return itself before it learned how to ask permission. In my mailbox, a photograph in an envelope with no return address. The photograph had edges soft as if someone's thumb had been worrying at them for years. In it, my husband stood at dusk with a man I did not recognize, near a car I did not like. The street looked familiar, the tilt of the curb, the broom bristle shadows, because it was our street. The angle told me the picture had been taken from our window. The note paper clipped to the photo said, "You should see this." I sat at the kitchen table, the bread tin beside me like a quiet witness. You can tell yourself you're ready for any story until a single picture tells you've been listening to the wrong narrator. Church is a place for relief, not theater. But folks do love a story, and when the truth is late to arrive, rumor performs in its clothes. At the committee meeting, 2 women held their mouths like they were carrying glass. A deacon asked me how my good fortune was treating me. On Facebook, Lord help us all, there was a thread that started as a carceral exchange and grew teeth. My name showed up next to words that don't deserve to be repeated in a house that keeps hymnals where others keep magazines. At the VFW bingo night, a man shouted B12 like it could cure what ailed us, and someone else said, too loud, maybe she'll buy the building. We laugh, hear the way we pray half out loud, half hoping someone with sense is listening. I kept my mouth soft. Dignity is not silence. It is choosing your audience. I wasn't about to feed the wolves my own bread. I swept my porch twice a day like a woman expecting company. I put fresh sheets on the bed the way you do when you need one corner of your life to be perfect. When people asked how I was, I said, I'm making do, which is the truth we tell when the fuller truth needs a little more time to get dressed. They wanted answers. I had only a window and a promise, and a letter that could make a liar out of either. The legal notice came like a school bell, a tone you obey whether you agree with it or not. A date circled in a red that felt like someone else's heartbeat. Respond by, it said, as if time were a polite conversation. Stress is a thief with neat hands. I woke with a jaw like a vice, and a heart that wanted to practice the drum. The doctor told me to rest. I told him I would, and then went home and stood at the window, because resting is not always lying down. Sometimes it's facing what scares you without adding to its weight. I set the bread tin on the sill, and put the letter beside it. The sky lowered its voice until the color deepened into that copper eye, both love and mistrust. I could see my reflection floating over the street, young and old, layered like a family portrait. I opened the envelope again. The words didn't change, but I did. I began to hear the sentences. Under the sentences, I saw phrases that were designed to look ordinary, but were carrying a burden too big for their clothes. I traced the signature, and felt the shape of my husband's days in the ink. What, I read, changed the story I'd been telling myself about him, and about what a promise costs. The letter wasn't a gift from a stranger. It was the bill for a sacrifice. My husband had agreed, years back, to stand up where other men sat down, not in a dramatic, headline way, in the way that takes your time, your sleep, and the quiet corners of your heart, where worry builds a nest. There were ledger entries that looked like nothing until I remembered how he counted change in his head, without moving his lips. There was a union memo with a date I recognized because that was the week he came home with the smell of copy paper and conviction. There was a notarized note, blunt, unpoetic, stating that certain monies would be held in trust until conditions were met. Conditions that included keeping your own name out of lights. The other name on the account, the one he never spoke, wasn't a lover or a liar. It was a witness, a way to move the truth safely through a place where truth kept getting mugged. The inheritance wasn't an inheritance. It was compensation owed, delayed, and dressed up to look like a favor. And it came with strings knotted by people who had learned to smile while they tightened them. Weakness became leverage, because the more they insisted I hush and sign, the clearer it was they were afraid of the noise a small woman can make when she's tired of being careful but claiming what was ours meant pulling back the sheet on some stories that still had living faces in them. It meant saying out loud that my husband was braver than I'd let myself admit. It meant risking the good opinion of people who thought they knew the shape of our days, taught to claim it. I had to expose a truth that could hurt people I love, and I had to do it with dignity, or I'd be proving their worst ideas about me instead of their wrong ones. Plans don't arrive fully formed. They grow like bread, quietly and all at once. I took the attic ladder down and went up into the warm dust, where we keep the parts of our lives that don't know they're important yet. I found boxes that felt like time capsules. Pay stubs, paper clipped with care, Polaroids with dates and names on the white margin because your grandfather knew memory needs labels to keep its manners. I made a list the way my mother taught me, one column for what I had, one for what I needed, and a third for what I could live without if I had to. I called the retired union man whose handshake had once felt like a signature. I asked the church secretary if she still had the minutes from a meeting where a certain discussion had been tabled with unusual urgency. I knocked at the neighbor's door, the one who likes to sit on his porch like a neighborhood historian, and asked if he remembered the night a car idled by our curb, longer than the engine liked. Every step cost something. The retired man said he was tired of fighting ghosts. The secretary said the box was in the basement and the basement was busy. The neighbor said he remembered more than he wanted to because he'd been young then and afraid of being old. At home. I set the documents on the kitchen table and felt the old would say, "You can lay that here. That's what a good table is for." The bread tin, faithful thing, sat like an extra pair of eyes. The last person I needed was the one I feared most. A woman whose job it had been to make sure feelings didn't interfere with math. She had a way of aligning papers that made you want to apologize for your handwriting. She also had a memory that didn't let the past get away with shortcuts. I called her. I asked nicely. She said, "Come by at dusk. Family means well even when they don't." One child told me, "Mama, let it go. What's due is due, and what's lost is gone." Another said, "Take the offer. Quiet money spends." The television muttered a commercial about safer investments as if it knew our kitchen was listening. A lawyer I had not hired found me anyway. He left a business card that glowed with the promise of painless solutions. "We can make this simple," he said, like a man selling umbrellas in a town that likes rain. He offered a number. It was not insulting. It was insufficient. Then came the anonymous letter in block letters that tried to look unemotional. "You don't know the whole story," it said, which is a phrase that both comforts and threatens because it's always true and often useless. I did what I've always done. I went to the window. The sky was rehearsing the copper I distrust, and the street held its breath like a choir waiting for the alto to begin. A car I recognized but had not seen in years slid to a stop at the curb. A man stepped out who used to carry himself like he could fix a fence with one hand and a handshake with the other. Time had tightened his shoulders and gentled his eyes. He looked up at the window like a person asking permission to speak. He knew the Dusk secret. He knew why my husband kept it. And he knew, I think, that I was ready to hear the whole story even if it asked me to stand a little taller than comfort recommends. He stood on my porch like a memory that learned to button its coat. We sat at the kitchen table because the living room was too proud for confession. He set his hat down. Men of a certain kind still do and folded his hands as if prayer might break out by accident. "I drove with him," he began, eyes on the wood grain. "Not often, only when the stakes were lopsided. He meant your grandfather. We'd meet a man by the mill, or a woman by the bus stop, and your husband would do more listening than talking. He carried things people couldn't carry alone, stories, numbers, names that had gotten too heavy." "Why the other name?" I asked. "Because the letter had dressed itself in a stranger's signature. Shield," he said. "Back then, if the company wanted to move a problem, they'd move a man. Your husband figured out a way to move the truth instead." The room tilted a little. I put my palm on the table to keep the house from sliding. In my mind I saw him, my steady man in his steady jacket, standing at our window at dusk, deciding how much of his day to admit to the night. "He asked me not to tell you," the visitor added softly. "Said you deserved whole sleep. Said he'd give you the whole story when it was safe to sleep through it." I wanted to be angry. Anger is a bright light, and I was tired of dusk. But anger is also a kind of shortcut, and I've never trusted a road that promises fewer miles than the map. So this compensation, I tapped the letter that had learned our address, not a favor. Owed wages, delayed, with interest, but they wrapped it in silence so they could claim it back if the wind changed. We sat a long while with the kettle cooling and the house listening. He finally said, "I'm sorry it found you late." "Truth finds us when we can bear it," I answered, surprising myself with borrowed wisdom. He nodded like a man who'd carried heavy boxers and knew the physics of weight. After he left, I cleaned the counter that was already clean and wound the clock that winds itself. When the middle of the night arrived and declared itself, I poured one glass of water and set out to, because some habits are prayers that forgot their words. I opened the bread tin. Beneath the grocery lists and a postcard with a watermelon farm under a sky too blue to be believed, there was a flat brown envelope I had never seen. It had my name on it in his not quite straight handwriting. How long had it waited? How long had I stood at this window, inches from it, not knowing? Inside, a ledger page in pencil, a copy of the union memo, a Polaroid of him shaking hands with the same porch visitor beside an office door that read claims. On the back, he had written, "If you ever have to stand alone, stand here," and he'd drawn a little square window with evening light behind it. I pressed the photo to my chest, Grief isn't only for death. Sometimes it's for the part of love that was working so hard to protect you, it forgot to invite you in. I cried, not the sobbing kind, the spilling kind. Quiet, steady, unavoidable. I prayed like an old hymn, not for money, for fairness, for the kind of ending that lets you look children in the eye and say, do right and rest. By the time the birds were stitching the horizon with their tiny needles of sound, I knew what I had to do. It wasn't brave, exactly. It was obedient to a promise bigger than the rule I'd broken. Morning puts starch in my spine. I made a list with a blue pen that always writes a little kinder than the black. I called the retired Union man and said, I'm not asking you to fight old battles. I'm asking you to confirm a page number. He laughed like a screen door and said, come by at dusk. I dialed the church and asked the secretary for the minutes from a certain month. Basement box, third shelf, second from the right, she said, as if I'd merely asked where we keep the winter candles. I phoned the regional office whose address had been disguising itself as a P.O. box and said, I'm putting the documents in order. I'll bring them Thursday. I'd like your name on a receipt. The pause told me I'd spoken the language they respect, paper and daylight. Then I called the local reporter who still prints names when they're earned and leaves them out when they're not. I might have a story, I said, or I might have something better, a correction. I put everything in a folder with metal prongs because truth likes to be held. The ledger, the memo, the photograph, the note in my husband's hand. I wrote a cover page like I was back in school. Sequence of events, witnesses, and grounds. I added, in tidy letters only old women still use, dignity. Before I left, I told you, sweetheart, because you were here with your blanket and your wide listening eyes. We don't hide from the truth in this house. We face it, and if it stares back, we ask it to sit and have a cup of tea. At dusk, I locked the door out of muscle memory, then unlocked it on purpose. I walked down our front steps in my good shoes and felt the porch boards. Bless me, wood remembers the weight of people who have decided, if this failed, it was over. But if it worked, it would not be victory. It would be balance restored. That's better. Balance is what lets a person sleep. They put us in a conference room with carpet that swallowed footsteps and a table long enough to make people forget their neighbors. A man in a suit with polite eyebrows introduced to colleagues, and I introduced my folder because it had better manners than my patience. I'm here to complete what was started, I said, not to invent, to finish. They spoke in the paragraphs that people use when they've practiced in a mirror. We appreciate your time. We are committed to clarity. There are complexities. Complexities are just details with their coats on, I answered, and slid the ledger copy across the table. Let's start where he started. I read the dates, like beadwork, slow and exact. I pointed to the memo, where the phrases held in trust and contingent upon appeared like hedges trimmed into the shape of animals. I laid the Polaroid near their legal pads and watched recognition flicker like a light bulb that needs a firmer twist. The retired Union man arrived in a jacket that had outlived 3 trends and said, I remember that meeting. We tabled it because the room got but the minutes are honest. He placed a photocopy thank you, church basement on the table like communion. They tried, we don't have that on file. I offered, then you can borrow mine. They tried, we can expedite a portion. I said we can conclude the whole. I kept my voice tidy and my sentences short. That's how you keep people from pretending you called a storm when all you did was open a window. The door opened near the end and a woman with pinnate hair stepped in. She wore authority like a sweater she forgot she owned. She glanced at the memo, the ledger, the picture, and then at my husband's handwriting. Her face traveled the distance from posture to humanity in one breath. I know this, she said quietly. I was there when they decided to structure it. It was meant to be a bridge. It became a moat. She looked at me the way you look at someone whose patience turned out to be precise. We can make this right. A series of phrases followed that sounded like paperwork falling into the correct drawers. Recognition of claim, release of funds, adjustment for delay, apology, private and formal, public, I said, and every eye in the room remembered the town we live in. Quiet money spends, yes, but quiet regret does not. People need to know when a thing is set back where it belongs. Silence. Even the carpet held its breath. Then the woman nodded once, Public sign, not the NDA the young lawyer would have liked. We signed acknowledgement and conclusion. The pen felt lighter this time, like it understood the story. As we rose, a voice from the hallway, older, familiar, wearing the little break in the middle like our town does when it tells the truth, said, "Mom, if you don't mind, there's one more piece." The porch visitor, the one who used to drive with my husband, stepped in with a folded sheet. "Your husband asked me to keep this until the account's settled." He handed me a note on plain lined paper, the edges browned by waiting. "If this reaches you, it means the worst turned into better. Buy yourself tulips. Fix the porch step the way I always meant to, and take the grandkids for ice cream on a day that doesn't need a reason. I love you, Jay." I folded the note around my heartbeat and answered, the only way a woman can when she has been given back something that was hers all along. "All right, then." The official statement ran in the local paper between the farm report and the Little League schedule. It used our names in the good way correctly and the company's name in the necessary way. It called the delay regrettable and the compensation owed. It said, "We thank Mrs. for her patience and persistence." I liked persistence. Patience gets all the credit when persistence is the one carrying the groceries. The funds arrived by daylight, as they should. I paid the bills that had been practicing for the circus and taught them to behave. I fixed the porch step, not the cheap way, the right way. I bought tulips with red edges that looked like they'd been whispering to the sunset. I sent a quiet envelope to a neighbor family that had more bravery than bandwidth. The church secretary cried on the phone and then apologized for crying, which is exactly how church secretaries do anything worth doing. At the diner, my once gold friend slid into the booth with a coffee and a face that had learned something. "I'm sorry," she said, without adding any decorations. "I was afraid your blessing meant there wouldn't be enough left for mine." "Fear does that," I said, "and we ate pie like a peace treaty." She laughed again with her feet on my furniture, and I realized forgiveness sounds like a spoon clinking a thick mug. I did not buy a new car. I did not turn our house into a showroom. I did put new knobs on the kitchen cabinets because every woman deserves to touch something she chose for herself. And I replaced the rattling fridge with one that hums in a tone the room understands. Life settled. Not the way dust settles when the energy leaves, but the way a lake settles after a boat stops making waves. Clearer, honest, and as always, at dusk, I stood at the window, not waiting this time, remembering. Gratitude can feel a lot like waiting when you hold it quietly. Then, because stories like a rhythm more than they like an ending, a letter arrived that wasn't about money at all. A child from the neighborhood, grown now, gone 10 years, wrote from a distant city. "I saw the article," she said. "I remember the light in your kitchen. I remember you letting me sit on your steps when home was too loud. I'm studying labor history. I didn't know your house was part of it. Thank you." I pinned that letter to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a watermelon slice, because some things belong where we look for them every day. "Come sit closer, sweetheart. The light does that nice trick at this hour where it forgives the corners and makes the middles glow. You asked me once what I learned in the long evening between love and loss and hope. I learned that quiet is not emptiness. It is where strength breathes. I learned that dignity is a door you carry. It swings on hinges you oil with truth, and you can open it anywhere you stand. I learned to keep receipts, not because I planned to throw them at people like confetti, but because memory loves to improvise and paper does not. Keep your pay stubs, keep your promises, keep your name clean so you can use it like a key when the time comes. I learned this country is a chorus, not a solo. Some days the harmony is off, some days a section forgets the words, but there's a line underneath the noise, a melody older than any one town, that says, work matters, neighbors matter, fairness matters. It says we rise for each other, even if it takes us a while to remember the tune. I learned that love tries to protect and sometimes overprotects, and that forgiveness is not a pardon, it's a path back to the table where we can tell the truer story. If you ever find yourself choosing between being right and being kind, try being precise. Precision lets kindness stand up straight. And I learned that a window is not just for looking out, it's for letting the light in. When the sky turns copper and your chest feels like a drawer full of tangled cords, stand by a window. Put a hand on something that has held your life, this sill, this bread tin, this cup, and remember that most storms go about their business whether you invite them or not. Your job is to be the house that stands. Tell me in the comments yes. I'm talking to you out there where you learned to wait with courage. Tell me who taught you to measure time by something kinder than a clock. I'll be here at dusk, like always, reading what you write. There's one last thing I kept by the window. I suppose it's time. Word travels on 3 feet in a town like ours, 2 for walking and 1 for leaning in. The church bulletin listed thanks to Mrs. for her example of persistence. The radio show between the farm report and the weather mentioned a local woman who reminded us that patience has paperwork. At the grocery, the cashier knew shy eyes like a fawn slid me a note with my receipt. Proud of you. I'm on online. The thread that once gnawed on my name turned into a neighborly potluck of amends. Didn't know the whole story. Should have minded my own stove. We're lucky to have you on our street. Luck has very little to do with it, but I clicked the little heart anyway because grace should have a way to count itself. I walked by the VFW, and a man raised his coffee like a flag. Good job, he said, in a voice that probably hasn't congratulated many people lately. I waved. That's enough. Word traveled farther than I ever planned. Far enough to reach people who needed to hear it. Far enough to come back carrying replies that felt like a porch swing finally catching a breeze. Asterisk, asterisk, back at the window. The evening does its copper trick. The grandchild's drawing is taped to the glass. A little square house. A big rectangular sky. A stick figure holding a tulip with red edges. The porch light clicks on because it likes to arrive early and make the dark feel expected. I hum a hymn whose lyrics come and go, but the notes know where they're going. The bread tin rests where it always has, inside it now. Fewer secrets, more souvenirs. The ledger copy. Asterisk, asterisk, the photo. The note in his hand, and beside them, a postcard with no return address that says only, next time, tell them about the postcard. I laughed because grief has a sense of humor if you let it. Sometimes the sky still turns copper and I feel him close, not like a haunting, like a habit that learned to be holy. I put my palm on the glass and the smudge matches it. Older, steadier. All right, I say to the room, to the dusk, to whoever keeps the calendar of small mercies. All right. If this story gave you courage, subscribe and share it with someone who needs a hand to hold. Even if it's only through a screen. I'll be here next Sunday at dusk. There's a postcard I kept for years with a picture of a lighthouse and no return address. The day it arrived, the phone rang at the same time, and I had to choose which mystery to answer first. Come back, and I'll tell you what I learned about light. Asterisk, asterisk, thank you for listening. Subscribe next story at dusk. Be good to your neighbors. The porch light's on.